The depth of Oklahoma's budget challenge became clear when the State Board of Equalization met in December to estimate how much revenue will be available for the 2016 fiscal year. With several lawmakers looking on, State Finance Secretary Preston Dorflinger presented numbers showing the governor will have about $6.9 billion to work with in writing her budget proposal, a drop of about 4.1% from last year.
Members, this is the number that the governor will have to build her executive budget, and we will have, of course, different numbers in February when this board convenes again to certify the February numbers.
State Treasurer Ken Miller says those numbers are widely projected to be even larger in February.
The majority think that if there is a change, that it will be a change for the worse, so there will be a bigger hole than we currently have. I think based on what's going on in the energy sector, not many people would think that hole is going to get smaller.
The biggest concern is the continuing fall of oil prices and the ripple effect on Oklahoma's energy industry.
If it were to shrink, the impact of that that you may see it in other places like everything from income tax to payroll tax to other types of revenue sources that affect our state budget.
At a media briefing this week on state revenue, Miller noted gross production taxes on oil and gas rose by more than 11% during calendar year 2014, but much of that increase came when oil prices were more than $84 a barrel, as opposed to current prices of around $50 a barrel.
Just about anyone would say if prices continue in the $50 range for very long, then it won't be long until we see some pretty significant softening in our gross production collections, and then eventually spillover effects into our income collections and consumption collections as well.
In the Oklahoma Economic Report issued by his office last month, Miller pointed to Oklahoma Tax Commission forecasts, which show a total negative impact of low oil prices on state revenues of more than $230 million, with nearly $180 million of that impacting the General Revenue Fund.
When you're looking at $230 million less available to apportion for state services, that's of concern, and certainly if the low prices are prolonged for a sustainable period, then that will continue into spillover effects for income collections, consumption tax collections, and the like.
Miller also cites the loss of non-recurring or so-called one-time funds, which were used to plug budget holes last year, accounting for about $291 million of the current shortfall.
We are plugging holes year after year after year with money that we find under the couch cushions or wherever to make the budget work. And at the same time that we can't fund our budget with recurring revenues, we're cutting our recurring revenues. I would say that's kind of putting the cart before the horse.
One of those recurring revenue sources will be cut halfway through the fiscal year when the state's top income tax rate drops from 5.25% to 5% in January of 2016. That's expected to cost the state another $48.9 million. The Equalization Board voted to implement the new tax rate after certifying that revenue projections were sufficient to trigger the cut. While Miller voted for the cut, he continues to oppose the use of triggers.
There's no reason to predicate a tax cut based on something that may happen in the future when one could just wait until the future happens to see if that event occurred and then cut the tax rate.
Miller also believes cutting taxes has limited the state's flexibility to deal with revenue shortfalls. And while he agrees tax cuts are a useful tool for stimulating the economy, he argues there are limits to their effectiveness.
I think that we can't just have wishful thinking and say that every time we cut taxes, it's going to pay for itself through economic growth. I think that's a fantasy. Do some tax cuts bring in additional revenue? Yes, they do. Do they bring in additional revenue to make up for all that was cut? Probably not.
Legislative leaders are already sounding warnings about the budgetary challenges. Speaker of the House Jeff Hickman this week told colleagues there will be tough times ahead.
This will be a year that requires sacrifice from those who utilize the services that state government was initially intended to provide. Sacrifice from our state employees who provide those services, and sacrifices as we determine what programs are beyond our mission and must be ended because they're luxuries we can no longer afford.
The budget shortfall may prompt a closer look at the billions of dollars the state gives away each year in tax credits and incentives. In a guest column for the Treasurer's Economic Report, Speaker Hickman writes, "It may be time for the legislature to create a fair and reasonable system that helps determine whether an incentive is truly sparking economic growth and creating stability in the market, or simply keeping certain entities alive that are dwindling or unable to stand on their own accord. Hickman also took aim at the earmarking of funds for certain programs, which reduces the amount lawmakers are able to appropriate, saying it may be time to evaluate all of the many dedicated funds to determine whether they still fulfill a modern goal. At the very least, lawmakers should consider more flexibility when drafting future legislation regarding dedicated funds. Miller would like to see more changes made to Oklahoma's tax code, but warns it won't be an easy fix.
There's hard work that has to accompany tax reform. It's not just as easy as cutting the revenues and closing your eyes and hoping things work out okay. I think that sometimes ideological experiments have unintended consequences, and I would point to the north to Kansas to see some of those unintended consequences.
Lawmakers will begin tackling the budgetary challenges when the first session of the 55th Legislature convenes February 2nd.